Buddha, great and limited. In today's class, we will discuss this subject. When we say Buddha, we mean not only Gautam the Buddha, but we refer to the core meaning of the word Buddha, that is to say, the enlightened one. There have been many enlightened ones before Buddha and after him, and therefore the word Buddha does not refer to Gautam the Buddha, but to all enlightened ones who experienced enlightenment as Gautam did and who propounded a spiritual path and a philosophy like Gautam did. And each of them, while they were great and they continue to be great, Buddha is both great and limited. Great because a Buddha brings in a spiritual revolution, helps hundreds and perhaps thousands to walk the path, creates a tradition and lineage of enlightened masters, changes the world for the better, far beyond you or I can do in 100 incarnations, creates spiritual texts and scriptures and paths, techniques and tools, and often a complete package of spirituality, philosophy, psychology, and way to live, what we call in the East as darshan. That makes every Buddha great. And at the same time, every Buddha is limited because of certain elements inherent in the spiritual and philosophical approach and creations of every Buddha. And this we contrast with ancient Indian tradition, which you can call Hindu tradition or Sanatan tradition or Indian tradition, where you have pluralism, spiritual pluralism, and a plurality of paths and approaches to enlightenment and to the way one lives and to the spiritual paradigm and to philosophy. So, in that context of all Buddhas versus this great plural tradition in India, in that context, we discuss today's topic of all Buddhas, which who are symbolized by the word Buddha as being great and limited. So we will see the greatness and we will see the limitations and the context in which both of them have been understood. Greatness we don't have to spend much time upon, everyone knows about it. Limitations is something we will be spending some time. So let us go into it. Let us start creating the context for our discussion by going into the history of the goal of life. How has the question of goal of life been answered in the long Indian history of spiritual and philosophical traditions? If we look at Indian spirituality, all schools in Indian spirituality can be divided into two parts. two categories: schools of liberation and schools of transformation. Schools of liberation believe that beyond a point you cannot be happy in this world, suffering cannot cease, the world cannot be transformed beyond a point, your life cannot be transformed beyond a point, and therefore the way out is to absolve oneself, extricate oneself, liberate oneself from engagement with this world. And as you liberate yourself from this world, the pleasure and pain both of the world go away. And you get into a situation of freedom, which is differently called as mukti, nirvana, situation of being liberated into a golok heaven, being liberated as a soul in front of God, or merge into God. So different schools of within the broad category of liberation exist. And each of these schools have their own idea of liberation and what happens to the soul after one is liberated. So some believe the soul becomes free, it is mukti, the soul becomes free and the soul can see everything, understand everything, but the soul is untouched by all that happens. The soul is free from the body and the soul does not have to reincarnate. The soul can see everything, understand everything, but is free. It does not under compulsion to incarnate and it remains free. That is one understanding of liberation. Second understanding is that the soul gets into experience of nirvana, an all negating absolute, where the entire existence is negated out, and in absolute negation, one experiences what is called shunya, and that is the situation of freedom. Then there is a third school which believes that there is something like a heaven, and the soul goes to heaven. And there it remains forever. This is one of the closest to, this Indian school is one of the closest to the Abrahamical Christian idea of heaven. Then you have the school of duality, which says that after liberation the soul remains around God, but the duality always remains. And there is a school of Laya which says the soul dissolves into God and remains no more. So these are all the various versions within the broad category of liberation. So this is one category of schools in Indian spirituality called the schools of liberation, and inside that group there are variations of what liberation is like. Second category is the category of transformation. These schools are the schools of Sri Krishna, Sri Aurobindo, and you can also put Tantra here. I forgot, it's a very important school, the school of Tantra. And they believe that we are not into a no hope pessimistic situation. We can improve ourselves and improve the world and create it in such a way. The self transformation and world transformation can be done in such a way that on the whole we are more happy than otherwise, and therefore it is not a loss making business to continue to engage in this world, and we can engage in this world even after being free. So the school of transformation says that the state of liberation is an intermediate state, and after attaining this state you have a choice. Either you can continue to be on the path of liberation, or you can decide to engage with the world and pursue the path of transformation even while you are free. So there is, in schools of transformation, there is involvement without entanglement. While the schools of liberation say that involvement without entanglement is not possible. So they by and large choose the path of renunciation, whereas schools of transformation choose the path of engagement and involvement. And then we have a completely different view when we look at the same question of the ultimate goal of life from a Brahmanical standpoint. There we have the idea of only one life and the judgment, and then it is reward or punishment. When we look at all the Buddhas essentially believe in the school of liberation. And they, within liberation, the state that they talk about as the state of enlightenment is the state of nirvana, all negating absolute, the shunya. Now what happens in us as we hear of this being the situation? That the soul is trapped in the world and we have to liberate ourselves from this world, and this is all there is to it. This is the whole game of existence. And this is what Buddha says, all the Buddhas say that this is what the whole game is all about. When we hear it, certain things happen in us. In most of us, something rebels. And this does not look like a convincing explanation. That the soul is trapped and then the soul has to escape by liberation. Somehow intuitively we don't feel this is a convincing explanation. We also find it difficult to share the pessimism that God or nature, whoever has created this world, would create such a pessimistic world. At best, we can come to this position of choice in evolution, that as the soul evolves, a stage appears when there is a choice. You can either follow the path of liberation or you can follow the path of transformation. And in case you follow the path of transformation, in case you follow the path of liberation, you attain freedom and then you withdraw. At best, you can help others to liberate themselves and withdraw, but essentially you withdraw. On the path of transformation, if you choose, you first attain some liberation experiences and then go into action. So this position is that a choice comes in the evolution of the soul where you choose the path of liberation or the path of transformation. That seems to be a more acceptable position. Let us further create the context for our subject. If we look at tradition that was before Buddha and which has continued after Buddha's also, here we can refer to Buddha as Gautam the Buddha. So the tradition before Gautam the Buddha and tradition which has continued after Gautam the Buddha. At the same time, if we compare and contrast the spiritual work of Shiva with Gautam the Buddha, what comes out of that analysis? If we look at Buddha, Gautam the Buddha particularly, other Buddhas after him have created different things, but if we focus on Gautam the Buddha, his path essentially is understanding that path essentially is desire is the root problem. It can be solved with awareness. And this awareness has to be used in certain ways called practices and to undergo certain experiences with awareness. But desire and awareness are the two poles. Desire is the problem, awareness is the solution. So the core work of Gautam the Buddha revolves around desire, and awareness. If we look at Indian tradition, there are many ways of attaining liberation. There are many ways of going in for transformation of self or the world. And the tools and approaches include all that I have listed here. Idol therapy, yoga, herbs, alchemy, energy healing, psychological analysis, path of devotion, Kriya Yoga, use of mantra and visualization. India has always been a treasure, a supermarket of all spiritual processes. And these paths include the paths of awareness, what Buddha says. So, the path that Gautam the Buddha emphasizes on was already a path in tradition before him and continues to be a path after him. If we look into tradition, we see hundreds and thousands of methods, and they can be all clubbed together into a few categories that I have put up here. In tradition, if we just look at one great figure, Shiva, he created 114 techniques, some people say 112 techniques, to achieve self-knowing and self-transformation and get into a state of full freedom, enlightenment. So he created these techniques, one for each chakra. Not in that mathematical exclusivist sense, but Shiva talked about 114 major chakras, or some people say 112 major chakras, and correspondingly created 114 techniques, some people say 112 techniques, to attain spiritual progress and enlightenment. And awareness is only one of these techniques, and there are many other techniques. Some of the techniques involve ingestion of certain herbs and certain alchemical processes. Symbolically, those alchemical processes are found in many tribes, some of which Carl Jung also came across in a very concise and changed form, at least. So, while Buddha focuses and develops and innovates on one technique of awareness, this technique is already there in the pre-Buddha tradition. And apart from this technique, there are many other techniques in the pre-Buddha tradition. The greatness of Buddha was to bring it out when it was forgotten and blind rituals had taken over. So it was a great contribution in rejuvenation rather than invention. And what has happened after Gautam the Buddha is other Buddhas and other masters and spiritual practitioners have started incorporating the elements from ancient tradition in a slightly repackaged way in whatever Buddhist schools they are in. Mahayana, Hinayana, Tibetan Buddhism, Sri Lankan Buddhism, whatever form they practice, customized to that school, that practice, they have customized elements from tradition, which are thousands of years old. So they realized that only awareness was not enough, and they repackaged and customized other elements of spiritual practice from tradition and made it a part of Buddhism. We don't find anything in Buddha's teaching which did not exist in the pre-Buddha Vedic spirituality, and it continues to exist post-Buddha also. So we find here a great revolutionary effort by Gautam the Buddha of introducing something which was forgotten and overcoming the distortions and forgetting of the real knowledge. But in essential terms, or I mean in scientific terms, all techniques that Gautam the Buddha used, or Buddhas after him, or enlightened masters after him used, they are essentially all found in tradition. In a generic sense. In a specific sense, of course, every person innovates, every age innovates, and as we go down history, we see much better versions of a generic technique being created, practiced, refined. So it's a continuous developmental process. But essentially, the roots of all of them are found in tradition. So then the question arises, why there is such an appeal for Buddha but not for the rest of tradition? Especially I'm talking of the West. Partly it has to do with Gautam the Buddha as a person. It's very honest, very existential, very truthful, very pure, and therefore his what he was as a person contributed as much to people believing him and what he said rather than others. So much of it has to do with the personality of Buddha himself, Gautam the Buddha. Much of it also has to do with Buddhas before him and after him. Their persona had a great appeal, which actually created the appeal for their teachings, their spiritual philosophy and worldview. Second element is, if you take up any school of liberation, it is easy to understand compared to the school of transformation, where the theory is very complicated. We come here to the idea of essential knowledge versus comprehensive knowledge. If you are a school of liberation, you can make do with essential knowledge. But if you are a school of transformation, you have no choice but to go into comprehensive knowledge. In school of liberation, also you can go into comprehensive knowledge, but you definitely have a choice of not doing it. So if you look at schools which have become very popular, they are schools of liberation who restrict themselves to essential knowledge and don't go into comprehensive knowledge. It is the comprehensive knowledge that is very complicated. Second, the transformation sadhana, the sadhana in the schools of transformation is far too difficult compared to the sadhana in the schools of liberation. Fourth, it is easy for a Western individual to understand one school which is focused on one element of awareness rather than a confederation of schools in Hinduism, where the sheer variety, the depth, the rare experiences they refer to, and the mystical alchemical approaches, they are too deep to comprehend for an ordinary individual. So if you just look at mindfulness meditation, vipassana meditation, awareness, biofeedback through awareness, it's much easier to do than to go into the depth of a tantra school or a Shaiva school or understand Sri Vidya or go into deeper parts of Sri Aurobindo. So it's very easy for a Western trained mind to take up a school of liberation which is based on one or two insights rather than take up a school of transformation. There is also an element of peace and bliss because schools of liberation essentially focus on peace and bliss, and this is what the Western mind needs far more than the struggle and the strife which can be prescribed by the school of transformation. A school of liberation also does not insist on any cultural change because ultimately everything has to be given up. Only meditative techniques can be adopted without any cultural change. Whereas schools of transformation will insist on a cultural change. And we realize that most of the meditative and healing techniques which are practiced by Gautam the Buddha, Buddha before him, Buddhas after him, many schools of Buddhism, most of them actually originate in pre-Buddha history. I mean pre-Gautam the Buddha history. Now, what is the complication in the school of transformation? If you look at schools of liberation, easy to understand. Schools of transformation, difficult. But let us understand how the schools of transformation appeal to us. Schools of transformation say that there is a principle of the universe, and the principle has decided the journey of the universe towards a positive end. And if you look at the whole life cycle of the universe, and you look at happiness in the whole life cycle, it is a profitable business if you look at the whole journey of the universe. If you contract the time scale and look only at short human history, it may appear that misery is more than happiness. But if you look at the full journey of the universe, happiness is far more than misery, and therefore existence justifies itself. This is the first thing that transformation schools say. Second, they say there is a broad structure to the evolution of the universe, to which human will can contribute in addition or subtraction. So we can make minor changes of pace, of ease, but essential design is already there, which is beyond human will. And therefore, even though the masters of liberation come and go, the world goes on exactly as it wants to go on, because the principle of the universe is far more powerful than all masters of liberation put together. Not only that, all masters of transformation also put together, and all masters of liberation and transformation both put together also. So the world goes on, the principle is far more powerful than all the masters of both of them put together. And no master or avatar is omnipotent. Nobody can challenge or override that principle, the principle of the universe. A great person can only, avatar can put the first step in evolution or the first brick, but the journey of the universe essentially is governed by a principle. And that no avatar, no master can change. He can only contribute in a minor way, far more than an ordinary individual, but still in a minor way only. If the principle does not allow, radical transitions don't take place. So schools and masters come to the center, go to the margins, become popular, they are forgotten, they are rediscovered, all the thing keeps happening in history, but nothing can change fundamentally the principle unless the principle itself wants to change. Fortunately, we are at a point today where science gives us hope for transformation of what is called nature of things. And when the nature of things undergoes a change, fundamental radical transformation is possible. So it seems the principle is such that now we are at the cusp of a fundamental change in the nature of things, and therefore we need not be so pessimistic as schools of liberations are. We can dare to be optimistic as schools of transformation are, because given the state of science, fundamental transformation seems possible. In this context, we put up our question, Buddha great and incomplete, not a question but a statement. And great, we all know, there is no question about it. Every Buddha does something that you and I can't do in 100 lives, and their contributions continue for centuries, thousands and millions of benefit from them. So there is no question of their greatness is established and given. They bring about a spiritual revolution. They have brought about centrality of desire and awareness, and this centrality is so precious that we don't realize how precious the centrality of desire and awareness is. In psychology also today, in psychoanalysis, we realize the centrality of desire, which the Buddhas realized thousands of years back. And in psychoanalysis, we realize the centrality of awareness, which again they realized thousands of years back. So the greatness is not in question, does not even require a discussion. But incompleteness is less known because human beings have this unconscious need to find somebody or something which is omnipotent. It can be a person, a master, a philosopher, a political leader, an ideology, some book. We are always in search of the omnipotent. Something so omnipotent that it will lead us to heaven on earth. And in that rush, we don't go into a calibrated, nuanced analysis, a hard analysis, and therefore we don't realize the incompleteness of any person or book or ideology that we believe in or worship. So this is true about all Buddhas, including Gautam the Buddha. And let us therefore look at the incompleteness, and this applies not only to Gautam the Buddha but all Buddhas, and not only all Buddhas but all enlightened masters who believe in the schools of liberation. So let us look at it. The first incompleteness is with the core philosophy. So the philosophy of how the universe has come into existence, how it works, where it is going. The philosophy related to the genesis of the soul, the journey of the soul, final end of the soul or the situation of the soul. So there is the view on the nature of things, a pessimistic view about the world. So this constitutes the core philosophy. Philosophy related to the genesis of the world, working of the world, purpose towards which the world is moving, if at all, and the philosophy related to the individual's life, related to history, and related to society. So there are problems with the core philosophy, that this core philosophy doesn't seem convincing to us. The pessimism, the inability to explain the purpose or the genesis. Then we have limitations of technique. The focus is by and large about technique of awareness when we talk of Gautam the Buddha, and it can also go to the in another way. If you look at other Buddhas, some of them had a similar problem of focusing only on one particular technique. Did not be always awareness, but one particular technique. And if we go to schools of liberation in the Vedic tradition, we can see exclusive focus on either devotion or mantra, any particular method. And that into itself is a technique limitation, technique incompleteness. Whereas if we look at Shiva or if we look at full tradition, we have a full basket full of techniques to pick and choose from and customize our own basket. The model of life is of renunciation, giving up pleasure, giving up the material part of it, which again is an incompleteness, a difficulty, a limitation. The social model of renunciation becomes unsustainable because children are not born to replace those who die. Many young people become monks, and therefore the ratio of working young to the old becomes unsustainable. The society also cannot defend itself if it goes too much into non-violence and too much into monkhood, which has happened once in India. Not once, actually, many times in India. The pessimism that nothing can be done about the fundamental nature of things in human life. You can call it pessimism, you can call it realism. So if you call it realism, it's not a limitation, rather it is a strength. But I personally see it as a limitation. The idea about the state of freedom as being only one state of nirvana, whereas in fact there is a pluralism of states that masters report as states of enlightenment. And nirvana is one of the states of enlightenment, not the only one. So this is another incompleteness of spiritual pluralism not being there. And with regard to individual life, there is a loss of juice because you look at desire per se as a difficulty, and renunciation per se as a technique. I mean, as a discipline of life. And this led Osho, Rajneesh, to talk about Buddha the Zorba, to complement the path of the Buddha with the path of the Zorba, to complement spirituality with materialism, renunciation with good things of life, and the loss of juice with the juice of life. So instead of non-involvement as is prescribed here, the idea is conscious involvement or later on free involvement. And because of these reasons, Buddha, although great, is incomplete. And that is where the school of transformation appears to us to be more convincing. Not that the school of transformation is complete. There are incompleteness in the school of transformation also, but it seems to be less incomplete compared to a school of liberation. So we see here the limitations of the approach of Gautam the Buddha and all other Buddhas and all other masters who are in the schools of liberation. There's nothing wrong in being in a school of liberation. One can be in school of liberation and go in for spiritual pluralism, and it should be perfectly okay. So where does it take us to ultimately? It takes us to the discussion on singularism versus pluralism. We have done that before. Liberation and transformation, it's a plural situation, it's a choice. When the soul is evolved enough, you can either choose this or choose this. It leads us to the point that enlightenment is a category word. When there is a plurality of enlightenment experiences. We have covered this in our discussion, effective enlightenment. Takes us into Eastern spiritualism versus a Brahmanical singularism. Is pluralism versus singularism. Takes us into Shiva's pluralism, where he lists out, expounds 112 or 114 different techniques essentially. And if you go into derivatives, it can go into hundreds, which can be used for spiritual practices. Also brings us to Sri Aurobindo's experience, where he experienced nirvana and then he experienced being filled up with something else and realization coming to him that you can move beyond nirvana into transformation without any reduction in the greatness of experience. And finally, it leads us to our topic, our subject heading, that the Buddha is great and incomplete. Thank you.